Hello, everyone, and greetings from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Welcome to our school's Secretary of the Navy Guest Lecture Series. I am Dr. Khalif Sepp, Chair of the Defense Analysis Department here at NPS, and I will be your moderator today. These lectures have been a featured part of the NPS student learning experience for decades. These lectures are normally held in the auditorium of King Hall. However, we have adapted to the COVID-19 environment, working and studying remotely, and today is our second virtual special guest lecture. Our format offers our guest speaker about 20 minutes for remarks, followed by a question and answer session. I have a joint team of NPS students with me today from the Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and Army, who will each ask a question of our guest. Some questions are from our students and faculty, and others may come from you, our viewers, during the session. It's now my privilege to introduce Vice Admiral Anne Rondeau, the president of the Naval Postgraduate School, who will introduce our guest speaker today. President Rondeau, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sepp, and welcome to everyone from Naval Postgrad School, as well as all of our viewers able to join us today for this terrific learning opportunity on the subject of leadership. Well, we're very pleased and honored to have with us today Admiral William McRaven. His career and indeed how he lives his life define the words patriot, warrior, scholar, intellect, gentleman, leader, and I might say also friend. He's a famous warrior. And rather than going through the bio that everybody knows and has read, let me point out that not only has he gone from being a warrior and then to a boardroom and the university culture as the Chancellor of the University of Texas system, he also was and is a graduate of NPS, where he earned his master's in 1993 to help establish the first graduate, and was himself the first graduate from the Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict curriculum. In fact, 8 students on the Q&A team today are part of your legacy, Admiral, all hailing from the evolution of the curriculum which you authored as part of your thesis. Now, also for our audience, it's important to know the Admiral is an author. He wrote in 1995, and everybody needs to pay attention here who is a student at NPS, because we exactly expect the same thing from you, that he wrote a book called Spec Ops in 1995 based on his NPS thesis. Then he wrote a book in 2017, which was famous based upon his speech at University of Texas, Make Your Bed, Little Things that Can Change Your Life. And then, of course, he's written the book Sea Stories. So the title of Admiral McRaven's speech and time with us today really is apt, from the battlefield to the boardroom. This is a man who has led in every single aspect of his life, professionally and personally. I am very honored and I'm privileged to introduce to everyone here Admiral Bill McRaven. Admiral, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, President Rondeau. Great to be here at the Naval Postgraduate School, if only virtually. To all of you out there, as President Rondeau said, I'm going to spend a few minutes this morning talking about leadership. So let's start with defining leadership. I think in the simplest terms, leadership is getting a mission done with the team you have. And the harder the mission, frankly, the harder the leadership is. You know, I don't think you can go to Naval Postgraduate School, certainly not in the defense analysis or the national security arena, and not find at some point in time in your career quoting Clausewitz. And in fact, I have my book from the Naval Postgraduate School that is dog-eared and highlighted. And there's a great quote in Clausewitz's book on war. And he says, everything in war is easy. It's just the easy things are difficult. Everything in war is easy. It's just the easy things are difficult. Well, that's what leadership is like. Everything in leadership is easy. It's just the easy things are difficult. I could get up on a chalkboard and tell you, hey, here's what you need to know about leadership. You need to lead from the front. You need to take care of your men and women. You need to have great integrity and character. It's easy to say, but frankly, it's hard to do because of all the sorts of things that impede upon your ability to be the man or woman you want to be on a day-to-day basis, to lead from the front, to do the things that we know good leaders should do. So I'm gonna walk you through a couple of vignettes in my career of points that I thought I learned a lot about leaders and leadership, and hopefully these will be of some value to you. So interestingly enough, while I talk a lot about my time in the SEAL teams, the best leadership experience I had that set with me for the rest of my career was when I was a midshipman going through the Naval ROTC program at the University of Texas. And for those of you not in the Navy, between your freshman and sophomore years, the Navy sent us on what was euphemistically called a cruise. And my cruise was in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and was on board a fast frigate, which is like a pointy-nose destroyer, a smaller version. And the Navy, in its wisdom, and I mean this seriously, in its wisdom, says you are a prospective officer, but the first thing you need to understand is what it's like to be an enlisted man. So on this cruise between your freshman and sophomore year, on the ship, I served as an enlisted man. I lived in the enlisted berthing. You know, you chipped paint, you scrubbed the heads, you worked in the boiler room, you did all of the things that the enlisted men did. And at the time, there were only men on the ship. You did all of those things. And what you realized very quickly was the impact of the decisions that the officers made. Every decision the officers made coming out of that boardroom, from the commanding officer to the executive officer to the division heads, every single one of those decisions had an impact on the sailors at the deck plate level. And the Navy wanted to instill that in you, for you to recognize the importance of those decisions and the impact of those decisions. Later on, we began to call this thing kind of professional distance, the distance between you as the leader and the decision maker and the rank and file that's working for you. If that professional distance ever gets too far apart, too large, where all you're doing is sitting in your office drinking coffee while the rank and file are down there working hard, you're not going to be making the best decision. Conversely, if the professional distance is too close, if you become too friendly, too familiar with the men and women working for you, it is difficult to make the hard decisions. So throughout your career, you've got to find this right balance of professional distance, knowing how close you need to be without getting too close, and always understanding, never forgetting that the decisions you make have a direct impact on the men and women that work for you. The next leadership lesson I had, and it was more a leadership observation, was actually between my sophomore and junior year. Back then, when you went through ROTC, you had 2 years to make a decision on whether you were going to sign on the dotted line and stay in the Navy. I think now for the ROTC folks, it's 1 year, but back then it was 2 years. And in between your sophomore and junior year, they send you all around the fleet. I mean, you spend time with the SEALs, you spend time with the Marines, on surface ships, with airplanes. But the best leader I saw, interestingly enough, not surprisingly, but interesting for me, was when I was on board the USS Simon Bolivar out of Charleston. It was a submarine, a big boomer, and the captain of the ship was a Navy commander named Weldon Koenig. And Commander Koenig happened to have been a University of Texas graduate. But the thing that impressed me about going on board that submarine was the fact that the submarine was immaculate. The crew on board the submarine had this incredible morale. I mean, they were so proud of the Simon Bolivar, and the commanding officer had a certain swagger about him. You know, we went out, we did a couple of dives, we surfaced, we had a Steel Beach picnic. He flew the University of Texas flag for all of us Texas middies that were there. He had a certain swagger about him and a certain ability to connect with the sailors on the submarine. He had a great sense of humor. He kind of harassed them. They would harass him. There was this mutual back and forth. And that showed me what a great leader looked like. And for the rest of my career, I remember thinking to myself back about the time I was on the Simon Bolivar and what I expected a leader to look like. Fast forward about 50 years, Admiral Koenig now lives about an hour from me, and I've had a chance to spend some time with him. He's a great old guy, and I had a chance to tell him about the fact that were it not for him, I probably wouldn't be in the Navy today, because he showed me what great leadership looked like. Let me move forward now. I graduated from the University of Texas in 1977. I go off to SEAL training, and as President Rondeau mentioned, I happened to have a little speech back in 2014 about my time in SEAL training, but I want to talk about a couple other points. First, the thing about SEAL training, for those of you unfamiliar, are the officers and the enlisted go through the same training. And it teaches you very early on that as a leader, you have got to be able to share the hardships and the danger with the men and women that work for you. And that was a lesson that was not lost on me. The men that worked for me as a SEAL, they wanted you to be out there, and they wanted you to share those hardships. And when you got into a command where you would find that the commanding officer didn't make it to morning PT because, oh, he had a phone call he had to take that morning, or the executive officer didn't show up because he had an appointment across town, some reason they didn't show up for PT, or they didn't make the dives, or they didn't make the runs. What you wanted as a rank and file in the SEAL teams, you wanted to look at your leaders and ask, are they there? Are they there when we're doing the hard stuff? Are they there when we're doing the jumps and the dive, the dangerous stuff? They better be. That's what's expected of us as leaders. And I will tell you, this didn't have to do with just my time in the SEAL team. I saw it everywhere I went. The great surface warfare officers were the officers who were spending time down in the boiler room where it was hot, where the sailors would see them sharing the hardships. The great aviators who would spend time on the flight line, with the wrench turners. The Marines who would get in the field with their grunts. I mean, this is what you have to do as a leader. You have to share the hardships and you have to share the dangers. The other part that I have spoken about before is when you go through SEAL training very early on, they give you this thing called an inflatable boat small, an IBS. It's about 8 feet long, weighs about 200 pounds when fully inflated. And in the first phase of training as a SEAL, prospective SEAL candidate, I mean, you run with this boat everywhere you go. It's on your head. You're carrying it over the sand dunes. You carry it to chow. But very early on in training, the instructors give you a very simple mission statement. We want you to take that boat. We want you to paddle out through the surf zone, paddle down a couple miles, and paddle back in. Very simple. Paddle out, paddle down, paddle in. And the idea is you got 7 guys in the boat. You got kind of 2 on the front, and then the first 2 guys, the guys we call the number 1 guys, they've got a little rubber strap. They pull the bow of the boat into the surf. The number 2 guys, they make sure the boat doesn't sway too bad. Number 3 guys, they're behind pushing. And then as the officer or the senior enlisted, as soon as that boat gets in the water, you jump in, you put your oar in the water, and then you call the guys in. 1's in, 2's in, 3's in. And then you find out about teamwork and what leadership is all about. Because if everybody in that boat doesn't dig just as hard, if everybody doesn't follow the stroke count, if everybody isn't part of the team, that boat's not going to make it through the surf zone. And your job as the coxswain, in this case, the officer, is to make sure that your team is pulling together as one to get the mission accomplished. But the other thing you learn in paddling that little rubber boat is that I don't care if you are the biggest, the strongest, the fastest, the smartest SEAL there, you can't paddle the boat by yourself. It's called the SEAL teams for a reason, because we recognize that in order to get the mission done, it takes a team. And I will tell you, when I went through training, my officers or my instructors always made sure that I understood what my responsibility was as an officer. And that was to get that little boat crew to get the job done. I never forgot the little rubber boat. Fast forward about 6 months in training, another great lesson happened very late. We started with 110 guys in my class. We're down to 33. We go out to San Clemente Island. It's an island about 80 miles off the coast of San Diego, and it's a military island. And again, this is 1977, so all of my instructors are Vietnam vets. And back then, as young SEALs, we did a lot of jungle warfare training, and we did a lot of ambush training. And the idea behind the ambush training was, in this case, we were going to get ambushed as a SEAL platoon. And the training, the drill was that the squad or the platoon you were in, 14 guys, you would walk along a road, and the instructors, the SEAL instructors, would be hiding somewhere along this road behind these bushes. There was a lot of kind of bushes back then. And somewhere along the way, you were going to get ambushed. And as the officer, your job was to get the platoon out of the kill zone. And what happened was, as you came up, if you get ambushed right or left, you yell ambush left, ambush right. Everybody returns fire, as much automatic fire as you can, and then you maneuver the platoon out of the kill zone. So we're making our way down in this training mission. As the officer in the time, you're the number 2 guy in the line of march. There's a point man, the officer is there, then the radio man, then everybody else behind you. So we're kind of patrolling along. I'm just waiting. We were waiting to get ambushed. And sure enough, all of a sudden the instructors open up from this hedgerow, and I yell ambush right. Everybody drops down. We start firing. And then I decide I'm going to have my John Wayne moment. I'm going to get up from my position and I'm going to run around the hedgerow, come up behind the instructors, surprise them, and mow them all down. And that's exactly what I do. I get up from my position, I run around the point man, I run around behind the hedgerow, I've got my M16 with blank automatic fire, and I mow down all the instructors. And I'm like, yeah, that was great. Well, needless to say, that didn't go over so well. First, the instructors were quick to point out to me that bullets go both ways. So when my guys were shooting into the instructors, of course, I was walking right into real bullets. But that's not actually where I caught the most amount of flack. When I came back to the platoon, I kind of got the, hey, WTF, sir. I said, what do you mean? I said, I got up, we went around, we got the bad guys, and they said, we didn't have a clue where you went. All we saw was that you got up and ran away in the middle of the fight. And I said, no, I got up and, well, you didn't tell us what you were doing. You didn't tell us what you were doing. In the middle of a crisis, and frankly, there's probably no bigger crisis than being ambushed in combat. In the middle of the crisis, you had better communicate up and down the chain of command and in as many directions as possible. One of the things leaders fail to do a lot of times is they get these ideas in their head, a little bit like my John Wayne idea, and they think that because they have somehow, told the masses that this is what they're going to do, that it's easy for the group to understand. You have got to communicate again and again and again. Never forgot that about communication. When I finally graduated, my first team that I went to was actually Underwater Demolition Team 11. And I had a great officer there named John Wright who told me the most important thing I needed to do as an officer was to listen. And he said, when you get to UDT 11, go find the command master chief, the senior enlisted guy, and sit down with him for a couple hours and see what he has to say about the team. Listen to the command master chief. Every command after that, the first thing I would do is go find the command master chief or the command sergeant major or the command chief master sergeant and sit down with them and listen. Too often as officers and as leaders, again, we think we know the answer. And sometimes if you talk to all the right people, they will confirm your beliefs. But frankly, if you want to know what's going on, spend some time listening. I found in Iraq and Afghanistan, I would go out on missions with the guys all the time. And sometimes you'd sit there during a break, sit down with one of the troops, and you listen to them. They're happy to tell you where they think things are screwed up or what you're doing well. I would walk the line at night, talk to the guys in the towers, listen to what the young soldiers had to say. And frankly, today more than ever, as leaders, we need to listen. Talk about setting high standards. So I get to fast forward a few more years. I am the executive officer at SEAL Team 1. Now, for those of you not in the Navy, an XO in the Navy, in our parlance, is the number 2 guy in a command. And the guy who was the commanding officer was a guy named Tim Holden, Commander Tim Holden. And Tim was a Naval Academy graduate, had a master's degree in MIT in engineering. He was an incredible officer. He was remarkably fit. I mean, he could out-PT anybody. He was frankly smarter than everybody in the team. He had a great sense of humor. He had all the attributes you would expect of a commander that you admire. But Commander Holden set incredibly high standards. I mean, we didn't just PT in the morning. We busted our hump every morning. We didn't just do missions. We did the most challenging missions we could find. Everything we did was to this standard of excellence that he expected from the men that worked for him at SEAL Team 1. Well, one point in time, about halfway through my tour there, an officer from one of the other SEAL teams on the West Coast came to join the team. And I remember we first meeting in the wardroom, and he was a fairly experienced lieutenant. And the commanding officer said, what do the other teams think about SEAL Team 1? And the guy said, without a hesitation, he said, sir, they think you're all a bunch of jerks. Well, it wasn't exactly jerks, but some variation of that word. And we took great pride in that, because the fact of the matter is, yeah, we were jerks because we were setting high standards. Nobody goes into an organization that's mediocre. They don't want to be part of a mediocre organization. None of you joined your organizations and said, hey, where's that mediocre organization? That's the one I want to be part of. No, you want to go be part of the best organization you can find. You do that, setting high standards, giving the men and women that work for you the resources they need to get your job done, give them the latitude to do the job, and then hold them accountable. That's a key fundamental to leadership. The value of being smart. One of the things you're going to find when you leave the Naval Postgraduate School or wherever you might be going to school at this time, you will be amazed at how much smarter you are. You may not appreciate that right now. I know I didn't when I graduated from Naval Postgraduate School, but when I got back to the fleet and I realized I could see things that my contemporaries couldn't because they hadn't been taught how to think, they hadn't been given the critical thinking skills they needed, that really makes a difference in your career and as a leader. I was fortunate to work for a lot of remarkably intelligent men and women who were highly read, highly sophisticated. They could see the strategic picture. Let me tell you, being smart is remarkably important for a leader. Let me get on to one more thing, and then I'll pause here. Leaders are ultimately responsible for everything that happens on their watch. And early on in my naval career, particularly spending time on ships, you get this sense from the commanding officer of a ship why everything that happens on that ship is his or her responsibility. If that ship runs aground and somebody says, yes, but the officer of the deck didn't wake up the commanding officer, so why should it be the commanding officer's fault? The answer is because the commanding officer didn't set the conditions so that young junior officer felt comfortable knocking on the door in the middle of the night and waking up the CO. When somebody gets in a bar fight on Liberty, it's that commanding officer's fault because obviously he didn't set the standards for good order and discipline. No matter what the problem is, at the end of the day, as the commanding officer, as the commander, it is your responsibility, period. You need to figure out how to manage those folks, how to lead them, how to inspire them, how to get them to do the right thing. But if something goes wrong, it's your responsibility. The other thing I found in great leaders is they never have a bad day. When I went on Desert Storm, we started off on a routine deployment, and I was part of the Compfibron 5 and the 13th Marine Expeditionary Force. The Commodore was a guy named Mike Quamatis, and Commodore Quamatis, Navy captain, had been a HAL pilot, a helo pilot in Vietnam, Greek by, I think, second generation Greek, had a big bushy mustache. He had all the swagger, a remarkable leader. Colonel John Rhodes was the Marine colonel in charge of the MEU, also a helicopter and pilot in Vietnam with 2 Silver Stars from action on the ground. And then Captain Braid Phillips, who was the commanding officer of one of our big deck amphibs. I have never been around 3 more impressive leaders in my day. None of them were SEALs. The amazing thing that I watched, I was a Navy commander at the time. I was the senior special operations guy on the amphibious ready group. And I watched these captains and colonels. And throughout the course of our ramp up, our workups for Desert Storm, and then we deploy, and then everything began to change. Every day there was something different about how we were going to go to the Persian Gulf or not go to the Persian Gulf. The deployment we were on got extended by 4 months. But every time you saw Commodore Quamatis, every time you saw Colonel Rhodes, every time you saw Captain Phillips, they were never having a bad day. Now, you know that they had problems at home, that their family missed them, that things weren't going well, but when they stepped in front of the troops, they were not having a bad day. And this is one of the things that I learned, certainly in my time in combat in Iraq or Afghanistan. If you as the commander walk in and you're having a bad day, everybody knows it. If you hang your head because things have gone wrong, then let me tell you, that will spread like wildfire. Your responsibility as a leader is to always keep your head up, look like you have a plan, hopefully you have a plan, and give people optimism and hope because you have done the hard work to get them through the tough times. But don't ever hang your head, don't ever have a bad day in front of the troops. And finally, character, good character. It's when I was being raised in the SEAL teams, we had a lot of, let's just say, rough men. They had come into the SEAL teams in the 60s. They had fought in Vietnam. They were rough men, and it was great to have rough men. And you learned a lot from these remarkable heroes that I grew up around. But finally, Naval Special Warfare Command was established in the mid 80s, and I can't remember the exact time, but finally Admiral Ray Smith, who I think also went to the Naval Postgraduate School. He was a Naval Academy graduate, and he took over the Naval Special Warfare community. He will never get the credit he fully deserves for making the community pivot in, I think, what was a very positive direction at the time. But Admiral Smith, once again, was one of these officers that you could look up to. He was, again, incredibly fit. He looked the part. Every decision he made was moral, legal, and ethical. You felt honored to be following this man. And make no mistake about it, character matters no matter where you are in the rank and file. So I'll finish up by just saying a couple of quick things. Really, leadership is about the physical, it is about the mental, and it is about the moral. Physically, you have to be there to share the hardships. You have to do the hard work. Frankly, nothing overcomes your shortfalls quite like hard work. You got to be able to persevere through the tough times, and you have to have a swagger. Swagger is a hard one. I mean, swagger is this balance between being overly confident, having too much hubris, and having the right amount of balance of, again, confidence and swagger and humor. Mental, you got to be smart, you got to be strategic, you have to listen, you have to reflect and be thoughtful. You have to get emotional every once in a while, but only when it's the right time. And finally, moral, always do what is moral, legal, and ethical. And with that, Gunner, I'm happy to pass it back to you. Thanks very much. Or President Rondo, either one.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Admiral. I took down notes because every time you talk, even I learn. But the impact of our decision, our ability to maintain professional distance. Are they there? About presence, teamwork, don't paddle the boat by yourself, communicate often, listen to others, high standards and accountability, the value of being smart, and leaders have a need to own it, as well as leaders never have a bad day, and character matters, and swagger and humor matter. Admiral, those are great things, and now it's time to turn it over to our students and their Q's and A's, and that I think that you'll find this a very engaging rest of the conversation. So, Gunnar, over to you.
Thank you, President Rondo. We have a great joint team of student volunteers from the Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and Army with diverse backgrounds, careers, and studies. Our students have read Admiral McRaven's recent interview with Vice Admiral Daly of the U.S. Naval Institute, and they accept the charge to pose challenging questions. Each student will ask a question of Admiral McRaven and will continue in rotation as long as we have time. I'll introduce each of them in alphabetical order. First up is Major Tanisha Christensen, a U.S. Air Force cyberspace officer. Tanisha graduated from North Carolina Central University and is currently pursuing her second Master of Science degree, assessing how to measure China's diplomatic and economic influence in Southeast Asia. Her next assignment will be in Washington, D.C. Major Christensen, what's your question for Admiral McRaven?
Sir, this question is from Major Travis Sloan, U.S. Air Force MC-130 Navigator. When speed and making a decision is important, what do you do to ensure the decision is as correct as it can be? And how do you ensure it does not get caught up in bureaucratic processes?
Yeah, thanks, Tanisha. Yeah, that's challenging. There's a couple things that go into the speed of a decision. I would offer the first thing is experience. So, when you are grappling with a problem, find the person that has the most experience in that problem set and draw on their expertise. When I was in command in Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm not a helicopter pilot, but I had some great pilots working for me. I'm not an AC-130 guy, but I had some great pilots and gunners working for me there. So invariably, if you need to make a decision quickly, find the people that are the experts. When I was the Chancellor of the University of Texas, my very first day on the job, I looked around my staff, which was very similar to when I was the Commander of U.S. SOCOM. I had MDs and PhDs and lawyers. I had no background in higher education or healthcare, but I knew how to ask the right people. So you need to make a decision quickly, find the person with the expertise, and draw on their experience. If you don't have anybody with that experience, then frankly, you need to think about whether you are rushing to failure. Sometimes we don't have all the information we need, but we feel compelled to make a decision. I would offer you're never going to get all the information you need, but if there are critical components of the problem that you don't have, maybe you better just take a step back, take a deep breath, and decide whether or not it is important to move forward and to, again, rush to failure. But bottom line in that question is find the person with the greatest experience and the expertise and draw on that.
Thank you, Admiral. Next up is Major Chris Gallegos, a U.S. Air Force U-28 pilot. Chris graduated from the University of Utah and earned his first Master of Science degree at the University of Arkansas. He is currently exploring the potential strategic value of using stratospheric balloons to enable special operations in denied or austere environments. His next assignment will be at Headquarters, United States Air Force. Major Gallegos, what's your question?
Sir, when delivering your speech at MIT's commencement ceremony this past May, you emphasized the importance of acting with moral courage. Do you have advice for how leaders can foster a culture of moral courage within their organizations that can endure in wartime, peacetime, and the gray area between?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. For moral courage, as I said earlier, there's three litmus tests I always had in making decisions. Is it moral, legal, and ethical? Ethical, are you following the rules? Legal, are you following the law? And moral, are you following what you know to be right? Obviously, moral becomes a little bit more challenging, but here's what I would offer. And I will go to my time as the Chancellor as almost a better representation. At the University of Texas system, we had about 230,000 students, 100,000 employees. Again, a very, very large organization. And in any large organization, people are making mistakes. And every once in a while, you see what you think is a systemic problem. And there are going to be a lot of people that tell you, well, as the Chancellor, you got to be careful about not rocking the boat. You have to be careful about, not taking a position because, there are going to be people that aren't going to be happy. Politicians, board members, they're just not going to be happy if you take a position on pick something. No, I understand. But you've got to decide whether or not you think that is the right position to take. And what I found in my time as Chancellor, and certainly this was reinforced by my time in the military, was when you take what you believe to be the right stand, you would be surprised how much support you garner, even from people that may not agree with you. If they know that you are doing something because you think it is the right thing to do, and you can make an argument for why you think it is the right thing to do, then what you will find then is the men and women that work for you, they will see how you act, just like any leader is. They will see how you act, and they will want to follow you. And they will hopefully want to take that into their kit bag and use it at some point in time in their career. Throughout my time in the service, I had an opportunity to watch great leaders. And when I would watch them, I would say, yep, that's the kind of leader I want to be, whether it was Weldon Koenig on the Simon Bolivar, whether it was Stanley Crystal or Dave Petraeus or Condoleezza Rice. I would be able to watch people and see how they did business and then try to take that into my personality and my leadership kit bag and use it. You do the things that are morally right, the people will follow you, and that will encourage them to be morally right the next time.
Thank you, Admiral. Our next presenter is Chief Warrant Officer 3 Jim Hall from the U.S. Army Special Forces. Jim graduated from the University of Michigan and is currently analyzing the strategic application of irregular warfare in great power competition. His next assignment will be the 5th Special Forces Group. Chief Warrant Officer Hall, what's your question for the Admiral?
Sir, my question is, what new technical or human capabilities will Special Operation Forces need to counter our opponents in great power competition?
Yeah, thanks, Chief. Well, a little bit of a broad question there, but so here's what I'd offer to you. And having spent time at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I have no doubt, at one of your courses kind of went back and reflected on military history. And of course, what you see in the course of military history is this kind of sine wave, or maybe this exponential curve of technology. And there is always a belief that the new technology is going to fundamentally change warfare. Gunpowder comes out. That's going to fundamentally change warfare. It did until the next person gets gunpowder. Now you got gunpowder on gunpowder. The machine gun comes out. We go from horses, from cavalry to motorized. Every time that there is this great leap in technology, somehow we believe that the nature of warfare will change. I've come to believe that that is just not the case. That at the end of the day, warfare is about kind of owning terrain. And in order to own terrain, you are going to have to put men and women on the ground to dominate that terrain. That means that there is going to be a mano at some point in time. It is going to come down to the gritty, tough parts of fighting in sometimes hand-to-hand combat. If you look at the Medal of Honor recipients from Iraq and Afghanistan, they were in close-in firefights, knife fights, hand-to-hand combat. And yet, here we were, the most sophisticated military in the world, with, Predators and Reapers overhead, with combat air patrols from F-18s, from aircraft carriers that launched from 1,000 miles away. You had all the intelligence in the world, and we would get our tails handed to us every once in a while by, barefooted men carrying Kalashnikovs. So the fact of the matter is, I still believe that warfare is fundamental. It is this fight between two opposing wills, and those opposing wills invariably come down to, human to human contact. So now in the great power wars, will, swarming, drones help? Will the ability to own space help? Of course, all of that will help. And don't misunderstand me. I'm a big supporter of technology, always have been. Any edge you can get, you want. But if we think that somehow when the North Koreans come south, or the Chinese invade Taiwan, or pick a scenario that we're working, at the end of the day, it's going to be about putting men and women in harm's way and fighting in a very difficult environment. And I don't think all of the technology in the world is going to be able to alleviate a whole lot of the suffering. So for whatever that's worth. That's not to say don't look for the next technology. So for those of you out there that are technologists, please press on. Find me something that is going to improve my fighting advantage. But I don't think it will fundamentally change warfare.
Admiral, next in the lineup is Major Alicia Job, a U.S. Marine Corps Foreign Area Officer. She graduated from Texas A&M University.
Jigga Maggies.
And is currently in the National Security Affairs Department pursuing a Master of Arts degree in European and Eurasian Security Studies with a certificate in intelligence. She will serve as either a defense attaché or a regional affairs officer upon graduation. Major Job, what's your question?
Good afternoon, sir. Gig'em.
Welcome.
So going into the international affairs, international relations side of things, my question is more so leadership in international affairs and international relationships. How do you believe that relations can be better maintained between the United States, international, global competitors, internal U.S. agencies, and NATO allies when considering security cooperation and also the United States' interests at home and abroad?
Yeah, thank you. I am a big believer in alliances and the strength of our partners. I was fortunate enough to be the first commander of the NATO Special Operations Forces. And I think we had 22 different nations that were part of NATO's SOF. One, probably the most fun I had in my career. But what I found in working with these great men and women was there was a sense of professionalism and dedication and patriotism that mirrored a lot of ours. And they were prepared to go fight with us. Alliances are incredibly important, but you don't know how good the people are until you spend time with them. I think this is one of the problems we have is, before Goldwater-Nichols, of course, you had Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and then the civilian agencies. Goldwater-Nichols forces our hand and makes us joint. And I will tell you, the best thing that Congress ever did, certainly for the special operations community, was to make us a joint warfighter. because what I found in leading the joint team was everybody brought a different culture, and that culture was incredibly important to the success of the mission. The Air Force had a different culture than the Navy, who had a different culture than the Army, who had a different culture from the Marine Corps, who had a fundamentally different culture from the State Department, the CIA, the NSA. But all of those cultures put together really made us incredibly strong. Diversity of thought, of background, of experience will get you to a better decision. But you won't know that unless you engage with these people. So if we want to strengthen our alliances, we're going to have to spend time with our alliances. Breaking away from them, I don't think it does us any good. Retreating behind, our border walls is not helpful. So if we want to continue to lead in the world, we need to strengthen these alliances. And if you sit down with people, you find out they have the same aspirations in many cases, they have the same dreams, they have the same hopes, they're equally as professional in some areas, and that becomes very reassuring as you're going to fight a complex fight. So when we start thinking about national security, recognize that let's make as many partners as we can, because we will need them in whatever fight or whatever effort we're going to put forth on the national scene.
Admiral, next we have Lieutenant Commander Mason Jones, a U.S. Navy SEAL officer. Mason is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and just earned his Master of Science degree, researching the effects of the global 5G environment on special operations. His next assignment will be at Special Operations Command Indo-Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Jones, what is your question for the Admiral?
Sir, my question is, do you think naval special warfare and greater U.S. SOCOM's main focus now should be to maintain pressure on terrorist threats? Or do we shift towards competing in global power competition like during the Cold War? Or do we cover down on both threats at the same time?
Yeah, I actually think that, we're capable of kind of walking and chewing gum at the same time. Even during the height of the GWAT, as you well know, there were elements of the special operations community that were focused on kind of major theater war. I don't think the shift between the GWAT and the low intensity conflicts and looking at our great power adversaries, I think we will be able to make that shift pretty easily. So we have the tools, we have the technology, we have the leadership, we've got great men and women that work in the special operations community. And as you know, first and foremost, we hire these men and women, to be critical thinkers, to be able to, move quickly on their feet. And so this ability to move from one end of the spectrum to the other, I don't think that will be hard. I know that that the current commander of SOCOM, General Clark, is looking at what this balance ought to be. But I can tell you, in my time as a SOCOM commander, you're always looking at that balance. How much resources do we apply towards Iraq versus Afghanistan? How about towards Somalia? What about Yemen? What about in the Indo-Pacific region where we have great powers rising when I was the SOCOM commander? So it is always about apportioning and balancing the force in order to meet the threat. But I'm not concerned at all that we'll be able to do that. Frankly, as well as the conventional force, they'll be able to flex and do that equally as well.
Thank you, Admiral. Next up is Lieutenant Commander Sam Lehner, a U.S. Navy SEAL officer. Sam is a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and just received his Master of Science degree here. His research on combat leadership is under review right now to potentially become an official manual on the roles and responsibilities of SEAL troop leaders. His next assignment will be at Naval Special Warfare Group 1 and then Special Boat Team 12. Lieutenant Commander Lehner, what is your question for the Admiral?
Sir, my question is, based on your knowledge and experience at every echelon of command, do you have any recommendations for how we can strengthen officer and non-commissioned officer relationships? And then do you have a personal anecdote you're willing to share about a former NCO or senior enlisted advisor who had a profound impact on you or members of your personnel or members of your command?
Yeah, thanks. It was interesting as I grew up, of course, as a Navy SEAL, 9/11 happens, and then I became, for the last third of my career, was in the joint arena. I had SEALs working for me, as you know, but it was the preponderance of my force was Army. And this relationship between the officer and the NCOs is absolutely critical. And it is something that you have to work on every single day. I go back to the very first bit of advice I got when I got to UDT 11 was, first person you need to see is the Command Master Chief. You go see the Command Master Chief because the Command Master Chief has got situational awareness that you as an officer might not have. The Command Master Chief has his ear to the ground when it comes to the concerns of the troops. So you always need to make sure you have a tight relationship with that Command Master Chief. I think about one of the great, I was fortunate again in my career to be blessed with some remarkable Command Master Chiefs. One that stands out for me is a guy named Steve Chamberlain. Chambo was my Master Chief at Naval Special Warfare Group 1 many years ago. I think he still works at Naval Special Warfare Command. He was a guy that could walk the walk and talk the talk. When Chambo thought I was doing something wrong, he did not hesitate to come into my office, close the door, and get on me. And this was what you need a good NCO to do, is to be prepared to speak truth to power. And Chambo and I would get into some heated discussions. And eventually, either one, I accepted his position or I didn't. But if I didn't agree with him, when he walked out of that room, he owned my decision. And that's what a great, I think, senior enlisted does. He recognizes that, look, I ought to be in a position to argue till the very last minute with the commander. But once the decision is made, my job as a senior enlisted is to rally the enlisted men as well to get them to do the mission. When I went on to my time in the joint arena, Command Sergeant Major Chris Ferris, who was my Command Sergeant Major at JSOC, and then I brought him to be my Command Sergeant Major at SOCOM, one of the finest men, officers, enlisted, period, that I have ever served with. Wickedly smart, incredible combat experience from Mogadishu to Bosnia and Kosovo and Iraq and Afghanistan. He had the respect of all the enlisted men across the special operations arena. And once again, Chris Ferris's strength was that he never hesitated to tell me the truth, whether it was convenient or not. But once I made a decision, nobody was a stronger supporter of my decision than Sergeant Major Ferris. And so I think as we begin to look at these relationships between the officers and the enlisted, we have to recognize that both sides have a role to play. At the end of the day, the officer will be held accountable, and the senior enlisted need to understand that. But by the same token, you need to make sure you have this partnership that gives you strength as a leader. You also need that battle buddy. As I said earlier on, you can't have a bad day. Well, rest assured, I had plenty of bad days. But when you have a bad day, when you have somebody like a Steve Chamberlain or a Chris Ferris, and you can go in behind closed doors and you slam the door and you drop as many profanities and frustrations and you get it all out of your system, and then you walk out together as a team, your head held high, you got a plan, and the troops will follow you. We always need to continue to reinforce the remarkable relationship between the officers and the NCOs.
Admiral, next in our lineup is Lieutenant Will Race, a U.S. Navy SEAL officer. Will graduated from the U.S. Naval
I want to know
Academy.
who's out fighting the war if all these SEALs are at Naval Postgraduate School.
I'm
sorry, Gunner, go ahead.
The basis for that begins here. Will received his Master of Science degree this month, and will be getting back into the fight. While he was here, he co-designed a model to improve the Naval Special Warfare Lessons Learned program. His next assignment will be at an East Coast-based SEAL team. Lieutenant Race, what's your question?
Good afternoon, sir. This question comes from Major Matt Haynes, U.S. Army Special Forces. In your experience, what are the most effective ways to present a dissenting opinion to military and civilian superiors when faced with a critical decision?
Yeah, the strength of the military that I've seen, and certainly in my experience in special operations, is you can absolutely have a dissenting view. In fact, as you well know, in the SEAL teams and my time with the Rangers and the Green Berets and the Marine Special Operations Forces, there is an expectation that if you're a young, corporal or private or sergeant or young officer, at the completion of a mission, if that mission didn't go well, you better speak up. They want to hear dissenting views. They want to hear dissenting views before the mission. But once the mission is decided upon, then again, everybody kind of gets together, salutes smartly, and moves out. So for you young officers out there, I will give you something that hopefully will help you keep the faith in your senior leaders. Because I can tell you, when I was a 3-star and a 4-star, I had a lot of opportunity to disagree with my senior officers. And I did so routinely. And they encouraged that dissent. I've got a picture somewhere around here where I am in the Oval Office disagreeing with the President of the United States. And the great thing about it is it was okay. It was okay as long as you presented your argument in a thoughtful manner that that was professional. And again, that's not to say you can't be passionate and have emotion, but don't ever make it personal. If you make it personal, you lose. If somehow you start calling somebody name, then your argument won't rule the day. But it was great in my time, again, as a 3-star and a 4-star within the Secretary of Defense and the senior leaders, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I always talk about my relationship with Marty Dempsey, who was the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and it was a phenomenal relationship. He and I disagreed on a lot of things, but he was okay with that. And then when he made a decision, once again, I shook hands and or saluted smartly and moved out.
Sir, the last in our lineup of presenters is Staff Sergeant Derek Sharpe. He's a U.S. Marine Raider critical skills operator. Derek graduated from Norwich University and is studying the contexts, causes, and outcomes of transitions in American grand strategy. His next assignment will be in the Combat Development and Integration Directorate at Marine Corps Special Operations Command. Staff Sergeant Sharpe, what's your question for Admiral McRaven?
Sir, my question is twofold. As a former Chancellor of the University of Texas system and the first graduate of what became the Defense Analysis Program here at MPS, how do you view the future of military education, both for officers and enlisted personnel? Related to that, how did your educational experience here at MPS influence your career after you graduated?
Yeah, thanks very much. Great and important questions. I'm such an advocate of education. When I was offered the opportunity to be the Chancellor at the University of Texas, I was thrilled to do it because the value of education in America, anywhere in the world, is critical, I think, to the success of whatever your endeavor will be. I was often asked when I was the Chancellor, what was the #1 national security problem that I thought? And people always thought I would answer Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and my answer was always the same: K through 12 education. My point was, if we weren't taking the opportunity to educate the young men and women in this country, to teach them to think critically, to teach them about new ideas and new cultures, to give them the foundation in STEM in order for them to be great national security proponents later on, then the national security of the United States was in jeopardy. Education, military education, and I would offer the strength of the Naval Postgraduate School is, I'm sure most of your faculty are civilians. And so you learn to think differently than if you went to a training environment at one of the, at some other maybe military school. There is a fundamental difference between training and education. I'm not sure I understood that when I first got to the Naval Postgraduate School. I had a couple of this, I got there in '91, the Soviet Union was still there. We were learning about orders of battle. And I remember I had a Navy commander that was teaching us about the order of battle of the Soviet Union. It was a PowerPoint-like brief, Harvard graphics, I think, back then. And I thought, this is great. This is what I want to do. I want to memorize facts. I want to know the order of battle. The next class I had was by a faculty member whose hair was down to his waist, who sometimes didn't show up exactly on time for class. And it drove me crazy until the end of his class, and I realized how much I had learned. To the second part of your question, when I left Naval Postgraduate School and I went to the Naval Special Warfare Command for a short period of time before taking command, I was stunned at what my contemporaries couldn't see, because I could see a problem now and interpret that problem differently because of the experience I had had at Naval Postgraduate School, because I had learned to think critically, because I had certain models that allowed me to overlay a model or a template on a problem and see that problem differently. Throughout the rest of my career, of course, I took the foundations of my thesis, the thesis on special operations, and I applied that to every mission I ever went on. Sometimes I'm asked, did you use that on the bin Laden raid? Of course I did. In fact, I used it on about 10,000 missions in the course of my time as commander of JSOC and the deputy commander. You bet I did. So my time at Naval Postgraduate School, I think, was instrumental and seminal to me continuing to move forward in the Navy.
Admiral, we still have a few minutes. With your permission, we'd like to go back to the top of the order.
Sure.
And ask a few more questions. Would that be all right?
Of course.
Tanisha, I'm going to hand it back to you for your next, for another question.
Sir, this question is from Professor Nafisi of the Defense Analysis Department. What do you think about mandatory national service?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about it. I'm a big believer on mandatory national service. Now, it doesn't have to be the military, but there are a lot of opportunities out there, I think, where the young men and women could serve for 2 years or 4 years for community service, and whether that is serving in Teach for America or finding an opportunity to help with whatever degree they have, I think it would be good. We've talked about a National Service Corps, where you could actually have a National Service Academy where men and women came to an academy. They learned the sort of skill set that would be needed domestically. So civil engineers that know how to deal with a water problem in Flint, Michigan, teachers that can go down and teach in the Rio Grande Valley, doctors, people that we can then train and teach and then send them out into the United States to be able to help and provide national service. Unfortunately, there are a lot of political reasons why it hasn't happened. There are a lot of funding reasons why it hasn't happened. But fundamentally, I think it makes you a better citizen of this country if you have an opportunity to serve and see what service is all about. And frankly, as all of you here know, service just, I think, makes you a better person.
Let's go to Chris, Major Gallegos.
Yes, sir. I'm going to pull a question from the live chat feed that we have going. It's from Navy Captain Enid Brackett. Referencing your comment that leaders can never have a bad day, how does that comport with the need for authentic leadership? How can we acknowledge difficulties in our subordinates and help them find a solution if we never acknowledge that we face similar challenges?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so let me, it'll sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. But let me offer this. A good leader has to have a plan, and a good leader has to be upfront. I'm not saying a good leader needs to lie about the fact that they're not feeling good or they've got depression. You take a look at some remarkable leaders during the Iraq War and the Afghan War have come forward and said, look, I've got issues that we need to deal with. And so a good leader has got to find the opportunity to tell the rank and file, look, if you need help, go out and get it. That is leadership. My point, however, is really about, when you get into a crisis situation or a very difficult, challenging situation, what you don't want is your leader to come forward and, hanging their head, dragging their feet, getting frustrated, yelling and screaming at the men and women that work for him. That doesn't work. Do you need a leader to look in the eyes of the men and women that work for him and say, look, I've got some issues, and here's what I'm doing. If you have issues, you ought to have them addressed because I'm having mine addressed? Absolutely. The truth is always the most powerful thing you can use. However, you just have to make sure you know when to express that and when to keep it inside a little bit for the benefit of the rank and file.
Admiral McRaven, that has to be our last question. Thank you, sir, and thank you, students, for your great questions. Let me now turn this back over to President Rondeau for her final thoughts and closing remarks. President Rondeau, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sip. So, Admiral, as always, your own authenticity and the life that you live and that you lead is exemplary for us in the model. And we just thank you for touching us on this day, but also remembering us all the time. And your comments about NPS are just terrific. But thanks for just being a great leader and being such an example for us all. For everybody out in the video, our next virtual lecture and guest lecture will be on 21 July on 5G with two stellar speakers, General Keith Alexander, who was the Commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and Vice Admiral Jan Tighe, who was Deputy CNO for Information Warfare and Director of Naval Intelligence. To everybody, thank you for this time. Admiral,
and if I can, real quick, I hate to cut you off, Ann, but let me just, I'm not sure who all is out there, but let me extend my thanks to all of you. One, for being here today, and hopefully you got some value out of this, but more importantly, you know, you probably hear it a lot, but you need to hear it from this old retired guy. Thanks so very, very much for what you're doing. Every one of you signed up probably after 9/11 or pretty doggone close to that. That is remarkable. I mean, that is a remarkable sense of service and patriotism, and thank you.
Well, so I cannot think of a better way to end this session. Thank you, sir, and thank you to all of you.
Thanks very much. Good luck to y'all.